Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books, and we are on the fourth part of the Progressive Plantation by Lorenzo Kom'boa Ervin. And this first segment we're starting with is Class Unity and POC Autonomy is the only real solidarity. If is going to be real class unity or solidarity, there is no way forward for either white anarchist, socialist, or autonomous peoples of color except to recognize the necessity of organizing movements based on new conceptions of class and race. We have to reject the hypocritical anarchist or white radical rhetoric that autonomous movements are somehow based mechanically on race and that a mainstream white radical movement is based on a superior conception of class or political unity. The conditions of blacks and peoples of color require a new political assessment and must be made a cardinal part of any radical tendency. We demand our right to be culturally and politically different and further demand that white anarchist radicals respect our right to disagree on political questions and to take a separate path based on one party's interest in opposition to the other. I'm not talking about racial separatism, nor will I give in to yet another useless coalition, which, like most black-white coalitions, have been organized with the whites truly dominating because of their access to superior resources and by having more political access. I'm talking about a situation where POC autonomist forces unite with white radicals when there is unity on a particular political issue, but then they must have respect for our autonomy at other times when we disagree or want to go our own way. So people of color creating autonomous movements instead of just joining white radical groups is a reflection of their own racial exclusion inside white-dominated movements as much as it is about local organizing, cultural autonomy, or political differences. Now, one thing white radicals must give up is the idea that the whole struggle hinges around white workers on their own deciding en masse to reject capitalism and racism. This fable will supposedly occur as the result of some kind of catastrophic event or social crisis that brings out the revolutionary marrow of white workers, according to white radicals. The truth is that there has been a series of major depressions, 2 world wars, and other catastrophic events, and it has now not caused a white-led revolution in 400 years of the American Republic, unless you count that series of events during the 1770s, which did free white folks from England colonialism while they themselves continued to hold slaves. The fact is, white folks in America have been a good guard dog for the stolen wealth of American capitalism, so long as they got their share. White immigrants were left out in the white social club and were considered dangerous foreigners. They were subjected to the cruelest class and social conditions. In the early 19th century, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants looked down their noses at Italians, Poles, Jews, and East Europeans. These immigrants weren't considered white, but social vermin, unpatriotic, and a dangerous economic class. However, when these estranged people got white political power and respectability, they were given a form of ethnic entree. Over the course of time, after having been accepted or worked their way into the club, they adopted the same prejudices toward blacks and other peoples of color, and the worst wasp a cultural snob had held against them. White radicals knew this, but many persist with this fiction of a heroic white working class who are supposedly so tolerant and willing to work on an equal basis with blacks. The truth is that there are no saviors coming from the white mother country to save black people. We are responsible for our own liberation. They may be white allies who will work with us, but we will let them only work with us for equality, mutual aid, and self-respect, not white self-interest. History has proven that only when the slaves or the oppressed peoples themselves rebel can the whites in sympathy support them, perhaps enough to turn the tide. The very idea that they, whites and people of color, are coming together because they like each other or the whites want to show they are not racist is the most sophomoric liberalism, rather than any revolutionary idea at all. Only when one understands that she or he is part of a revolutionary movement to restructure society, even if only wins immediate gains in the early stages, can the talk of functional unity be given any credence whatsoever. Of course, such a movement cannot be white-led, which has its own tremendous negative implications and results. Rather than swallowing a false or romantic view, I will say that the only way black and POC and white people can really work in cooperation is when there is shared leadership, interest, and risk-taking inside a mass movement for racial and social justice, rather than in civil society generally. A white-led movement cannot ever be allowed to usurp the basic role of people of color themselves to fight for their own freedom. The paternalistic idea that whites know what is best for peoples of color is virulent in the European, American, UK, and South African anarchist and left movements. They even try to get members of color to submit to a political loyalty oath around issues of race so that it will not become an internal issue. Let's be honest, like many white people in a racist society generally, they try not to discuss such issues unless they firmly control the agenda and format. Again, they fear a challenge to their own racism. For the most part, not only do the white radicals tolerate tokenism, rather than empowerment of POC in the anarchist movement, they have wholly different ideas about fighting racism. They do not deal with the state's mass imprisonment of the poor and black youth, police murder in the streets, infant mortality, or massive poverty in communities of color. Instead, they see racism as discrimination in individual cases, marginal vigilante racist groups, or just something that the ruling class uses as a strategy to split the black from the white. But these are concerns about racism from a white perspective, not from those actually victimized. So activists of color must bring the issue to them based on our political understanding, experiences, and based on our actual conditions of oppression. We must be clear that although we may believe in many things together, we must lead the fight for our own freedom. White people still don't fully understand you can only build a mass movement for a total social change when the poor and oppressed peoples of color are leading it, not a privileged white workers and activists. We can work with anyone, but only on conditions of principled unity and shared interest, not because of liberal racial cliches of, it's a good thing we're all together in the same room and we've got to love one another, or we're all in the same boat. The black movement and the movements of other peoples of color need allies in its battle against the racist capital class, not the usual white liberal or phony radical support, but genuine revolutionary working class support and solidarity, otherwise called mutual aid by anarchists. The base of such unity, however, must be principled and be based on class interest rather than liberal guilt-tripping, do-gooding, or opportunism and manipulation by liberal or radical political parties. The needs of the oppressed people must be the most important consideration because they want genuine support, not fakery or leftist rhetoric. There is so much distrust of white radicals among black people because of years of these radicals' misconduct in our communities of color and improper dealings with activists of color. White radicals have always seen the issues revolving around their concepts of the white working class coming to its senses, recognizing its historical mission as leading class and saving us all. How noble, but how wrong. I believe that blacks and people of color in America throughout the world must begin to organize autonomous movements among their own peoples. They cannot defer to white activists. No one will hear and act in response to our cries for help, and no one can do that work in our communities that we alone can only do. One reason there are so few blacks or anarchists of color is because the movement provides no means to reach people of color, win them over to anarchism or socialism, and help them organize themselves. This must change if we want the social revolution to take place in America, and if we want North American anarchism or socialism to be more than just another white rights movement. I have never understood why others have not had a problem with this. The failure of anarchism and socialism to build a racially and ethnically diverse movement is one of its greatest failings. It may yet doom the entire movement to defeat. So anarchists and progressives will have to get their own house in order before they can effectively build an anti-racist movement to educate or organize other whites and unite with POC on a principled basis. Because of internal racism, too many activists of color are starting to talk critically about the class and race flaws in the contemporary anarchist and anti-globalization movements for it to continue to be ignored. Inviting peoples of color into the movement, but on a basis where they are fully empowered, is absolutely essential. This should be elementary, not a problem to be debated endlessly or evaded altogether. Building an anti-racist liberation support movement. For years, it has been known there are some very simple components to an anti-racist tendency on the left. This type of organization must be a mass organization where it can unite all workers and poor people in common class struggle, but it must also be able to recognize the duty to support and adopt the special demands of black and other non-white peoples as those of the entire working class. It must challenge white supremacy on a daily basis in both white working class communities and radical social change organizations. It must refute racist philosophy and propaganda and must counter racist mobilizations and attacks with armed self-defense and street fighting when necessary. The objective of such mass movement was to win elements of the white working class over to an anti-white supremacy, white or class consciousness position, to unite the entire working class, and to directly confront the right wing. This program must function in conjunction with pre-existing struggles in communities of color, not as a white left vanguard dominating the entire movement. So I have never called for a white-led or white rights organization like those I have criticized. The cooperation and solidarity of all workers and poor people is essential for full social revolution, not just its privileged white sector. They must be willing to follow the lead of poor and oppressed workers and activists of color, as was done during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This is something that the white left has not been able to do, and it is why they set up their own all-white groups, which in no time at all lapse into journalism and racial exclusion. As revolutionaries, we must always understand our objective is to overthrow the capitalist state and its rulers, and that we must live the politics we preach. Racism is intolerable. This movement must have the potential to deconstruct the racist capitalist state and construct an entirely new society on anti-authoritarian principles. It has to go beyond white left campaigns of the past, or it's just empty rhetoric. So I am proposing something different, an anti-racist tendency as a political movement to change society itself. This would be a race and class-based revolutionary movement, not content to sit around and read books, elect a few black politicians or friends of labor to Congress or the state legislature, write protests, circulate petitions, or other such tame liberal reform tactics. It also would not be concerned with white middle-class leftist issues like Nazi youth music, or the so-called vanguard role of white workers, animal rights, world trade reform, and other white rights campaigns. For years, I've asked these white radicals, what about racial profiling, mass imprisonment of blacks, Latinos, and the poor, police murder and brutality, etc., and other hallmarks of racist society? Why are you not uniting with black and other non-white peoples? I've never got a satisfactory response to these questions. This proposed campaign I am speaking of is around issues that could also act as a pole of attraction for peoples of color to this movement because they directly affect them. Further, raising issues of the crushing of human rights of poor and working class people of color, especially the millions of homeless and unemployed in the inner cities, could push it further than the agenda of the old civil rights movement, which only tepidly raised issues of racial discrimination and exploitation of the poor to demand reforms of capitalism, but shied away from anything that sounded vaguely like socialism. We must be willing to fight in the streets with the poor, racially oppressed, and economically downpressed people, because that is who we are. It would take the examples of the early radical labor movements like the IWW, as well as the later civil rights, Black Panther movements of the 1960s, and the welfare rights movement, to show that only direct action tactics of confrontation and militant protest will yield any results at all. We also have to study the examples of the 1992 Los Angeles and 2001 Cincinnati rebellions, which show that, once again, while poor people will revolt, there need to be powerful allies extending material aid and resistance information. These allies can also start resistance and support campaigns in the white communities. We need to also show there is an existing mass movement to take it to the next step and spread insurrection on a long-term basis. For the most part, the anarchist and socialist movements still does not even deal with police murder or brutality, prison, or certain kinds of uncomfortable racist issues like criminalization of youth of color, except in a peripheral way as political rhetoric. I have not seen the various anarchist Black Cross or anarchist racist or anti-racist action groups or the white-led socialist parties deal with the disproportionate imprisonment of black people in the U.S., 10 times that of white people, the frequent police murders of black civilians, or the racial profiling of the millions of black people each year. So we must also challenge our allies in the anarchist, anti-globalization movements, and Occupy Wall Street movement to both act as true political allies and serve as a source of material support while still respecting our autonomy. This is why I am continually saying that it is necessary for white workers to defend the democratic rights and gains of non-white workers in the general society, instead of just fighting for white rights on the job and or white issues of social advancement. Finally, to be clear, this anti-racist movement is a coalition of peoples of color with white allies, but it has to be recognized as a cardinal principle by all that oppressed people have a right to self-determination, including the right to run their own organizations in liberation struggle. More importantly, inside the anti-racism movement itself, the peoples of color have to take the lead, even if they share it with others. The victims of racism know best how to fight back against it. The anarchist, socialist, and other white radicals must recognize this and help build a militant anti-racist group which would be both a support group for the Black Revolution and a mass organizing center to unite the class of poor peoples and oppressed. It is very important to wrest the mass influence of the racial equality movement out of the hands of the left liberal democratic wing of the social class. The left liberals like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton may talk a good fight, but as long as they are not overthrowing capitalism and smashing the state, they will betray and sabotage the entire struggle against racism. The strategy of the left liberals is to deflect class consciousness into strictly race consciousness, and then call for mere enforcement of the civil rights laws by the federal government. For the most part, they refuse to appeal to class material interests in the U.S., white working and middle classes to support black rights, and as a result, allow the right wing to capitalize unopposed on the latent racist feelings among whites, as well as on their economic insecurity. Jackson did this during his political campaigns, but only to win votes for the Democrats. They do not even try to organize the black working class poor. The kind of movement I am proposing will step in the breach and attack white supremacy and dismantle the very threads of what hold capitalism together. Without the mass white consensus to the rule of the American state and the systems of white skin privilege, capitalism could not continue to function without interruption. Anarchists and socialists have to stop giving lip service to all this. The way they apply it, race treason, is a farce, just as the latest political fads since whites don't have to really be inconvenienced or challenged. However, true anti-racist politics challenge the notion of whites doing anything less than putting their own lives and future on the line for a new society and dismantling a capitalist system which, while it brutally oppresses peoples of color and exploits all of us as working people, building diversity on the left, building support for POC liberation movements. Having railed against the current state of the anarchist and social movements, which is based entirely too much on white conceptions of the struggle, we must now talk about what we can do to fix this. First, anarchists especially, and socialist radicals need to break away from so much close identification with punk rock and the white youth culture that supports it. This has been a two-edged sword for years, bringing in many new recruits, but also trapping anarchist and radical politics in a white cultural milieu, which is hostile to everything else. I say this even though I am mindful that many young Chicanos also get involved as anarchists through cultural association with this musical form. We need to recognize and become in other youth cultural scenes like hip-hop, but even acid jazz, salsa, and other cultural forms. Although this is one sure reason why this movement is so white-dominated at this time, there are others of equal importance. The most obvious being that the predominantly white anarchists have never recruited in communities of color, nor tried to act as a pole of attraction for black POC activists. For instance, they generally do not hold forums in communities of color, nor even distribute literature at black bookstores or community centers in Chicano or Asian neighborhoods or on native reservations. They make no real attempt to connect with those communities, and even when there are POC groups or individuals sympathetic to anarchism or socialism, generally they do not connect with them either. This makes no sense, and I have criticized it for years. It is cultural suicide and political chauvinism. Someone else called it white cultural nationalism, and I am inclined to agree. As I have pointed out endlessly to various anarchist and socialist groups, you must have an organizational platform people of color can identify with, not just white middle class issues like radical environmentalism, animal rights, veganism, anti-automobile causes, Nazi youth music, and other white campaigns, if you want their support and active participation. People who are suffering from massive imprisonment, 1 million black youth and adults, will see their friends and relatives murdered by the police, who are ill-nourished, housed and clothed, who are forced to live in ghettos and subjected to daily racism, are not too concerned with chip mills, back to nature, the welfare of whales, or testing animals in labs. This does not mean that these things are not important, but they are middle-class white folks' issue, not that of a desperate urban black or brown working class. You white folks might get mad at me for saying this, but it is the truth. It is race and class privilege. Even as much as white activists would like to see numerous people of color join their activist groups, this most likely won't happen. 1. They are given no voice or respect in white movements. Even those interested in anarchism or socialism will probably join or create their own POC groups and then deal with white activist groups from a position of co-equal organizations. This is actually a better position for all involved, dealing with a group rather than as an individual for joint operations means larger numbers of participants of color, and it also means mutual respect and joint inclusion in a project planning for the POC. It means an equal voice rather than white control and being forced to follow behind somebody else's prepared agenda. An autonomous people of color organization of sufficient size and strength ensures the ability to reshape the entire movement and end internal racial exclusion, as well as other forms of misconduct. It can bring in considerable numbers of people of color and extend anarchism and socialism to people in areas where it has never gone. I believe that it is necessary for anarchism and socialism to be extended to common people rather than middle-class white dropouts and activists. A successful social revolution without black, poor people of color simply ain't even happening. It is defeatism. Until the anti-globalization movement and Occupy Wall Street movement unites with black POC and poor folks around a broader agenda than just reform of Wall Street, the World Trade Organization, and other capitalist institutions, it will be nothing more than a white rights movement which advocates in the West for poor and black and third world peoples, but cringes in fear and distaste if they ever meet one. They are just reluctant reformers of the international capitalist system at this point. Fearing violent revolution, they rigidly advocate for Western-style, nonviolent social change. Although making a lot of disruptive noise, they are doing nothing that fundamentally challenges capitalism as a world power and will soon start to run aground based on these limitations and the internal contradictions of their weak race and class politics. They will learn, just as other social movements that have the privileged upper classes that cannot speak for the poor, white people cannot advocate for peoples of color, and fundamentally you cannot reform cancer. It must be destroyed. So although I think it is important to unite with such campaigns on the short-term basis, they should receive unsparing criticism if they do not listen to those of us at the bottom. They will not make the revolution anyway, and they are not truly anti-capitalist. They are merely a transitional movement until something more militant comes along. I talk more about this in the next section. Critique of the anti-globalization movement. Some feel that the anti-globalization movement is one of the best anti-capitalist radical projects to come along in years to involve anarchists and socialists as a core group. Its tactics of blockading meetings of the capitalist world political and financial ministers created a deep sense of crisis among the rich and powerful ever since the Seattle '99 protests erupted. These tactics harken back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the labor protests of the 1930s, and the broadness of the coalition and tactics to disrupt the status quo. But it has serious flaws as well. For instance, some of the environmental groups in the coalition are willing to settle for mere reforms of the multinational corporations and new government protective regulations of wilderness areas. There are also NGOs who are part of the movement which are nothing but government-created liberal trade lobbies. Some of the labor groups have a narrow trade union agenda, and in addition, There are a variety of religious and pacifist groups opposed to anything but a government-managed peaceful protest. But for myself and other activists of color, the worst flaw is that the movement is so white and middle class, although this has changed over the last decade. Like the anarchist and progressive movements generally, it has not made any real efforts to connect with black POC neighborhoods in the cities that it has organized in, not raised issues in a fashion that make blacks or peoples of color interested in the movement. For instance, it talks about international financial institutions like the World Bank, World Trade Organization, or the International Monetary Fund, and how they are forcing third world governments to adopt austerity policy and starve their people. They also talk about those countries being victimized by IMF, World Bank banking policies that have plunged the countries into deep debt to Western bankers. But they don't seem to realize that the same institutions are responsible for unemployment, homelessness, the shutting down of industries, and massive poverty in the inner cities of the United States and other Western countries. They just don't get it. They support economic human rights campaigns as long as it involves countries thousands of miles away, while ignoring those arising on their own doorstep. The movement has to reevaluate its political direction and should broaden its base by including the inner city poor and peoples of color, not just radical environmentalists, rank-and-file labor students, and anarchist groups. Welfare mothers, prisoners, black community organizers, poor people in the barrio, on Indian reservations, and grassroots folks of all sorts could take equal part if this were deemed a priority by leaders and activists in the movement. I feel the anarchist people of color movement should just muscle its way in, as they started to do in Quebec City, Canada in 2001, when the Free Trade of the Americas Summit was held. As activists of color within the anarchist and anti-globalization movements, we have to demand that our issues are respected and that the poor peoples of color be given an equal place in the movement. We have been invisible for too long. This participation can only strengthen the overall movement and give it an even harder edge when so many of capitalism's poorest victims take part. One thing, for sure, they will not be so willing to do is to compromise the white middle class elements. They have nothing to lose. Just think, a movement now which can disrupt the smooth flow of capitalist planning in Seattle and other cities would then become one when it ignites with when it unites with all of capitalist victims powerful enough to begin to take over and dismantle the entire international finance system. We go from a movement of thousands to millions worldwide in a campaign capable of reconstructing society and the world economy itself. Let's get busy. We've got a world to win.